Hey everyone, in this video I want to go over a little bit more dealing with inputs and outputs. Particularly, I think this will help you out with some of the lab assignments that we have here in this chapter. So one of the things that I want to do is go through Lab 2.9 together and let's walk through the thought process. So starting off, it says that a variable like usernum can store a value like an integer, extend the given program to print usernum values as indicated, and then submit for 2 points. So just like the other labs, I want to do these stepwise. I want to get this one completely, done before I move on to part 2, because part 2 just adds on to what was there before. And then the same thing with part 3. Part 3 adds on to part 2. So once we get done, we'll have the full finished product and hopefully we'll have a 5 out of 5. So let's go ahead and get started. We want to have this enter integer 4 and then you entered 4. And this is the code that they give us. So one thing, whenever I'm dealing with these lab activities and you can type the code in, of course it's perfectly acceptable to type the code in here as you work and just sort of interactively debug it that way. I prefer to work in idle though. I just feel like it's a better experience. So let's do that. We're going to create a new script file. I'm going to go ahead and save this in my workspace directory. We'll call it lab29.py. And then I'm just going to paste the code that they gave us. So usernum equals this. And let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So we know that an input, a call to an input function, is what stops the program and allows the user to enter something. So we can see an example of that over here. Enter something. And let's say I enter 4. Then that 4 is now stored in A. Okay. One thing that we also want to be cognizant of is our data types. So I've said it before. I tend to say it a lot. Inputs always return a string. So if we look at the type of A right now, we see that that is a string. And if I wanted to do something like multiply that value by 2, I would probably do something like A times 2. But that gave me 44. And the reason being is because it's dealing with the string 4. So it's saying, alright, you're taking a string and multiplying it by 2, then it's just going to double the string. So it's going to say, alright, well, I'll put a 4, and then I'll put a second 4, and that's where the 44 comes from. Now that may not be what we intended though. And what we intended might have been to do some multiplication with integers. So one thing we can do is we can convert A to an integer by saying that A equals int A. So if A is originally a string, like we see up here, then it's going to try its best to convert it to an integer, and it'll save that back in to A. So if we run that, and then we take the type of A, we see now it's an integer. So we've done what's called type conversion right here. Now that it's an integer, if I do an A times 2, we're doing arithmetic, and I get an 8 instead of 44. Okay, so hopefully that sheds a little bit of light of what's going on up here. Is we have this input that's going to prompt the user for an integer. They might enter something like 4 or 50. And then that value is going to be passed to this int function, which does the type conversion like it did down here. So that final integer that gets converted from the input is ultimately assigned to user num. From there, we can print out you entered colon user num. Get rid of that comment, save it, and then we can run this and see what it looks like. So enter integer 4, and it says you entered 4. Awesome. So let's take this and copy it, and then over here I'm just going to replace everything with that, and then we can run it. Cool, so we got the first two right. Basically, the user entered 4. Now you won't see that 4 here. That's one of the frustrating things about Zybook test is, and it has a technical explanation. I'd be happy to go into that if you're interested in it, but for now I'll spare you the details and just sort of sum it up into that this input is provided, but it's never shown in the output, if that makes sense. So when we are organically running a program, like here, I wouldn't normally have this slash in. I would just run it like this, and you would enter your input on the same line as the prompt. That differs from up here, because up here there was that new line character which brought us down to the next line, and then it sat here and waited for us to type something in, like the 4, and press enter. Well, this looks a little bit more like what they wanted, right? However, when the test is run, due to the way that the test is run, let me get back to the Zybook here. Let's see what happens if we take this new line character out and hit submit. So if we do that, we see that there is actually no line break between here, and that's because nobody is actually typing 4 in and pressing enter. When you type 4 in and press enter right here, the enter key is what actually moves you to the next line. So they are trying to artificially create that enter key press by putting a new line character in here. I realize it's probably a source of frustration for you guys. It's a source of frustration for me too when it comes to trying to explain what's going on and how come we would normally write a program like this, but when we submit it to the Zybook, we got to put these new line characters in. And the whole reason is just to make it line up with the expected output due to the way that the test processes input. That was kind of a mouthful, maybe a little bit confusing, so if I can help clear that up for you at all, just let me know. Until then, just know that when we do inputs and we're providing them to the Zybook for tests, let's throw a new line character on the end so that it looks like this instead of like that. Alright, so one more time, let's submit it, make sure we're good. Awesome, so we're getting 2 out of 5, and we should be ready to move on to step 2. So now let's extend the output, extend to output the input squared and cubed. So compute squared as user num times user num, submit for 2 points, so for a total of 4 points. Alright, let's pull this over here so we can still look at this. And then over here, what we want to do is start making our program do that. So it looks like we have these first 2 lines. We have this 4 stored in a variable. And then we need to say that that number squared is 16. So I know that I've already got this number stored somewhere. I need to store this number somewhere, this 16. So let's create another variable. Let's call it user num squared. And that's just going to be user num times user num. Now, alternatively, you could write that as user num to the second. And then we might as well, looking ahead, go ahead and figure out what's the cubed. 64. So user num cubed equals user num to the third. So I'm just going to take the shortcut there. You could do the multiplication 3 times if you wanted to as well. Now, so important things to notice here is that this 4 and 16, we do not want to take this line and just say, alright, go ahead and print that for me, please. Because if I take this code and if I put it in here and submit it, let me put that new line character back. Okay, we get this part right, but look at what happens when the input's different. When the input is 50, it expects us to say that you entered 50, And instead of saying that 4 squared is 16, it should be 50 squared is 2500. So what I like to say is we want to write our programs generically to where they work off the variables rather than hard-coded values like 4 and 16. So what we can do is we can take this and we can modify it. This 4 right here is going to come from where? Well, that is my user num. Okay, if I want to print out the value stored at user num, then I won't put that in quotes. Now, what I do want to print out though is this. Let's move this over just a little. This squared is. I need to put that in quotes because that's something that I literally want to print out. Squared is, comma, where does this 16 come from? Do I have a variable that has 16 stored in it when user num is 4? Yes, I do. It's user num squared. Okay, and then let's do the same thing for and 4 cubed is this. So print user num. Oh, I'm sorry, I did that wrong. Print and user num cubed is user num cubed, and then 2 exclamation points. Then we'll go ahead and put that new line up here so I don't make that mistake again. So it takes a little bit of skill, but I don't feel like it's that difficult to sort of parse out what it is that it wants to output and break that into variables that we have and string literals. So remember, variables here show up in white, string literals show up in green. Let's save this and run it. So we'll test this out. Let's test it out with 4. Of course, on the next line. Awesome, that looks great. And if I was curious, I would run it again and I would say, let me try it with 50 then. And I get different numbers. Those numbers should match up with the expected output right down here, and they do. So I'm feeling a little bit more confident. I'm going to copy this code, take it over here and paste it in, and let's submit for grading. Awesome, so I got those additional 2 points, so I'm 4 out of 5 now. Last thing I need to do is step 3, and step 3 is to extend to get a second user input into user num2, and then to output the sum and the product. So let's see, they entered 4, and then they entered 5, so 4 plus 5 is 9, and 4 times 5 is 20. Easy enough. So let's come back over here. We want to get a second user input. So programmers are usually inherently lazy. Let's just come up here and copy this and paste it. And let's just call this user num2, so we got to give it a different name. We don't want to overwrite this one. We want to keep that around. So we'll call this user num2, and we also need to make this say enter another integer. Okay, so it matches that verbiage right here. And then from there we just want to take this, so I can copy that. We can do a print on that, but remember we don't want to print hard-coded values like 4, 5, and 9. Instead we want to use variables. Now I've got a variable for 4 and 5, I don't have one for 9. So let's create something called summation and set it equal to user num plus user num2, and then let's create a product and set that equal to user num times user num2. So there I have the summation of it and the product from the multiplication. Now I'm ready to come back in here and substitute in my variables. This one doesn't have a lot of string literals in it, so I'm actually just going to write it underneath. So the 4 comes from user num, okay, and then I want to have a plus. The 5 comes from user num2, and then I want to have the word is, and then the 9 comes from summation. Now remember, when we do our prints with these commas separating them, we get an implicit space. So that's going to put these spaces in that you don't see down here in my print statement because this is implicit. So let me get rid of this, And then let me copy this line because the product's going to be just about the same. Instead, we're going to turn this into multiplication sign, and then this is going to be product. So if we save that and run it, we can test it out. We can do 4 and 5, and we get 9 and 20, so that matches up. So let's copy this code, come over here and paste it in, and submit for grading. And if all went well, it's going to check our code with 4 and 5, gets the right answers, so everything's good. Okay, so I hope that cleared up a little bit. The other one that I wanted to look at is the escape characters one. So this one wants you to write a program that displays the base state sales tax for the following states and output the data in a table. Space your columns out with 2 tabs and design your program to match the sample execution below. Cool, so what do we want to take away from there? Is to design our programs with 2 tabs to space it out. That's going to make things a lot easier for us. There's also this hint here that we need to use string concatenation so there isn't a space between the tax and the percent sign. Okay, so starting out, let's create a new script file. I can just close out of this one now. And let's save that as lab 210. And I want to take this code and paste it in over here. Alright, so your solution goes here. This is just, it's like a comment. It's a triple quoted string, so it's just a string that's sitting here. That's where our solution goes, so let's get rid of that. And what I'll do is I'll help you build up a little bit of it, but then let you take it the rest of the way. So first off, how are we going to do this part right here? Because like I see that we have our states listed on this left hand side, and I see that we have variables for our states, state 1, state 2, state 3, and so on. And then our rates are listed on the right hand side, and we also have variables for those rates, so like 6, 4, 4.75, and 6. But we also have column headers, and we have these lines sort of dividing the column header from the column data. So how can we do that? Well, we want to literally print that state, and then here's where the tabs come in. So these are supposed to be 2 tabs in between these columns. So remembering back to escape sequences always start with a backslash, and then they're followed by a character. So the character for a tab is T. So this \T is the equivalent of hitting the tab button. So we want to have 2 tabs, and then we'll say rate. And then let's do these lines. So looks like there's 1 line for each character in the word. So state has 5 characters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tab, tab, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 for rate. Awesome. Now, this next part, the way that we've been doing print statements is by separating our string literals and our variables with commas. So we've been doing something like print state 1, tab, tab, state 1, rate. Right? So that's sort of building it up. As a matter of fact, we can run this. Save it. And check that out. That actually looks pretty good. Pretty close to what we are expecting over here. But if we take this code, let's copy this and paste it down here and go to submit mode and submit it. Let's see what the Zybook thinks about it. So the Zybook is saying that, hey, you've got, and let's try to decipher what all this means. It's showing us up here that there's extra spaces, or spaces that it did not expect. And we can see that from up here, the 6 should be aligned with the first dash and the R, but in our output over here, it's actually aligned with the second dash and the A. And that's because there's a space right there. So we have a space here, and then the two tabs that we put in there. So how can we fix that? Well, that's where the hint came in, where it says use string concatenation so there isn't a space. So we've talked about how these spaces, the commas put in implicit spaces. Well, the alternative is to do string concatenation, where we just say put this string together with this string, so hence the plus sign, and then put that string together with this string. Now this is all well and good until we hit an error maybe dealing with other data types. So let's run this and see what happens. And what we end up getting is this type error. So it's saying that it can't convert the int object to string implicitly. So it can't do this conversion from an int to a string without being told to do so. Now, looking at this line, this print state1 rate. Which one of these variables do you think is an integer? Which one is it complaining about? Is it state1? Well, if I look at state1, I can see that state1 is FL, and it's denoted with single quotes. So from what we've learned so far, that is a string. And state1 rate is 6. It does not have any quotes around it, so that must be interpreted as an integer. So in a print statement, when we're doing concatenation with these plus signs, we have to make sure that everything is a string that we're adding together. So to convert this to a string is very similar to how we convert a string to an integer. Remember, to do that we use the int function. Well, to convert an integer to a string, we'll use the str function. And you can see it takes an object, so it takes something, and it converts it, or it returns a string. So let's take this state1 rate integer and convert it to a string, and then add it to this string over here. Alright, so I'm going to need one more close parens, because I've got open, open, close, so close. Let's run this and make sure it works. Awesome, so that looks a little bit better. And then let's copy this and submit it for grading. Awesome, so now the only thing I'm missing is the percent sign, right? So now all we need to do is just plus a percent onto the end. One thing I want to point out is that this would not have even been possible to get the percent to sort of line up right up against the 6 if we were still using commas. So let me show you what I mean. First, let's run this, verify that it works. Yep, that looks awesome. And then let me go back to what we had before. We had this print state1, comma, tab, comma, state1 rate, comma, and then we would probably throw that percent on the end. So nice thing about separating with commas is we don't have to worry about doing these conversions, like converting an int to a string, but the downfall is we get these implicit spaces. So let me run this and let's look at the difference between these two. Look at that. So we got that implicit space there, we got an implicit space there, and we also have one right after the 6. So like I was saying, by separating our literals and variables with commas, we make it impossible for us to get this percent sign to line up right against the 6. So sometimes we have to use string concatenation. There's no other way around it. Alright, so I just wanted to point that out. We can take this, chunk it in there, and then submit it. And you'll see now we're on the right track. So basically you just got to finish this lab up, put in the rest of the states, so state 2, through 5, and as long as you follow this pattern right here, you shouldn't run into any issues. But I hope that you are taking away the, I guess, the theory behind this on why we are using concatenation. If not, or if you have any other questions, please reach out to me. Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.